Strategy program at the New America Foundation, which I know many of you know. It's so great to be with you. This is my first time up at one of Rachel's salons for our Leadership Council. I want to point out just a couple of people real quick. First, Rita Hauser was the chairman of my Directors Council, and her husband, Gus Hauser, who I just learned was an original founder of C-SPAN, one of my favorite joints in town in Washington. Is Scott Delman here? I haven't seen Scott yet, but he's also a Leadership Council. And Bal Das, who's with us. Bal, thank you so much. I think he's grabbing his sandwich and coming in. These forums are designed to create an opportunity to have an exchange around a wide variety of contemporary public policy issues, and these are really Rachel's shows. She brings in the talent, and we try to stir it up, and we end precisely before 1:30, which I promise you will do. On April 2nd, we have an important forum, the London G20 Economic Summit of the 20 leading industrial nations, economic nations in the world, looking at how to get the global economy going, and we'll be talking a little bit about that today with three outstanding folks. Robert Hormats is an old friend, been vice chairman of Goldman Sachs International for years, a regular on virtually every economic commentary show for quite a long time, a former assistant secretary of state, a good friend of my former boss. We were just discussing Bob yesterday and the likelihood that he'd be returning to government service, hopefully. So to add a little spin, he says he's not going yet, and not until all the issues are set, but we look forward to having him, hopefully, in the Obama administration. My colleague, Doug Redeker, who's director of the Global Strategic Finance Initiative at the New America Foundation, previously was in London and sort of was one of the sort of chefs of the global financial markets abroad, and knows just about everyone there, and has really interesting insights into the emergence in the features of global financial markets, of state capitalism, and has brought, I think, a very interesting set of approaches to New America's economic program and activities and policy work. And then another old friend, Richard Medley, chairman of Medley Capital, also worked in the Congress for quite a while and has just emerged as well as one of the leading authorities who, I was just joking when Vice President Cheney was saying, no one saw this crisis coming. I thought Richard Medley did. And let many of those that he was connected to know. So it's great to be with all of you here today.
I couldn't tell you because you're with Goldman.
Yeah, the only ones who didn't see it coming were Goldman Sachs. So the international division may have seen it, right? You have a firewall between international. That's right. You did well.
Tell Richard.
But I think what we'll do is talk for a few minutes about how folks are looking at the London G20 summit, and particularly given the handicapping that's going out in the media. I think one of the really interesting questions is, are we at a point in looking at the global economy where if these guys get it wrong on April 2nd, which so many seem to be thinking they will, what does that mean for our economic futures? And if they were to get it right, what would getting it right look like? And let me start with Bob Hormats, if I may.
Well, I think there are really three ways of looking at it. One, in using your context of getting it right, getting it wrong. I actually think that the biggest problem would occur not simply if they got it wrong, but if the meeting ended up in a lot of disputes. Can you hear me? Is it better now? I think the big tragedy, the serious problems would occur if, in fact, this meeting led to a series of disputes, either at the meeting itself or afterwards, where they came out and briefed the press in very different and very contradictory ways. This has happened in past G7 summits, where there was either a dispute within the context of the conference that spilled over, or subsequently they went home and took pot shots at one another or said things that were very inconsistent with what other heads of state or heads of government were saying. In other words, if this leads to major divisions or exacerbates major divisions or highlights in the public eye, in the eye of the market, for instance, major divisions, fundamental ones, that would be very destabilizing for a market and for a world that's looking for some degree of consensus, some degree of common effort, even if not the same effort by each country, at least common efforts working in the same direction. On the other hand, getting it right, I think, involves several things, one of which is a general agreement, acceptance of the notion that each country will take stimulative measures, not necessarily the same and not necessarily at the same time, but will do whatever is needed. And obviously there are differences of approach between the United States and the two major continental European countries, France and Germany. But even there, if these countries, if these leaders indicate that they're moving toward doing what they think is necessary and would do more if they thought that were required sometime down the road. So stimulus is important, but I wouldn't imagine that there's going to be a major fight over that. The second, I think they've actually reached some general agreements, at least there's a preliminary communique which suggests that they've reached some general agreement on at least the outlines of regulatory reform. Not so much the details, but the general thrust of regulatory reform. More adequate capital, better global supervision, more authority for the Financial Stability Forum, which is going to be called the Financial Stability Board as a result of this summit, so that they're moving in the same direction in general on that, both in terms of at home and abroad. What? Right.
We were just we were jokingly changing the word forum to board is change you can believe it.
Yeah, well, that's right. We'll see. But the word will have more power anyway, presumably. The other thing that would be important, I think, is a strong commitment about protectionism. And there is some interesting language that says that if there are measures that are taken by countries, they will consider, in fact, reversing them. If that's the case, that's quite significant. And there'll be a monitoring device, either the IMF or the WTO or both. That would be very helpful because I think there is this general concern about a danger of slipping into protectionism. One country does it, others follow, using that first one as an example. The World Bank's indicated 17 countries have already taken measures, not great, not Smoot-Hawley kind of measures, but nonetheless substantial measures that have at least some impact on trade, not dramatic, but some. These are the kind of things that I think are the things that we'll see coming out of this. And the last is, and perhaps the most important, is strengthening the IMF, and more importantly, giving the IMF and other institutions more resources to help the developing and emerging economies that have been badly hit by this crisis. And it seems to me that this is something that the G20 can do and do quite effectively, and that is pledge more money to the IMF, not just the industrialized countries, but the emerging economies, China and Saudi Arabia and some others, but also support the multilateral development institutions to a greater degree, because in fact, before this crisis, 10% of American GDP was accounted for by exports. So to the extent we can help emerging economies that are desperately in need in some cases of money to survive and be able to at least work through this crisis, it helps us as well. So I think if they do this kind of package, it's not dramatic, it's not a breakthrough, but summits don't produce breakthroughs normally. And there have been very few that have. If I can't really remember one that produced one.
Thanks, Robert. Let me jump to Richard real quick and kind of get a more conversational format going. Robert's done a great job of outlining what I think would be a modest summit, but maybe can we at this point of where we are with the global economy and the collapse of trust, if you will, in institutions, collapse of trust in leadership that's led to a collapse of consumption, really, around the world. Is the outline, I think Bob is exactly right, that that's probably what will come out, but is that enough?
Yeah, I think it's enough, actually. I mean, I think that's what you expect out of summits, I think, as long as you don't devolve, as Bob said, into that. But I do think we look at tail risks in our fund and things like that. What could be a surprise? And there are three things that we're looking at, two big and one just for entertainment value. And the big one is Obama and the fact that world leaders, and I don't know if anyone saw, but there's been a raft of polls out this morning, and Obama's approval rate has actually risen fairly dramatically in the past week. It's in the mid-60s now. For instance, Putin, who rarely is afraid of anyone who he can't poison, wants to have a very short meeting with Obama because he doesn't know how to handle him. And the Obama people agree because they don't want to have a, I looked into the eyes of Putin and I understand his soul moment. So people are approaching these bilaterals with Obama with a lot more tentativeness than we've seen in previous years. It's going to give Obama the chance to dictate some of the tenor of these. In particular, China. And the Chinese, the WHO, we always say, you've got who and when, and you can make your own Abbott and Costello joke. But the bilateral between Obama and WHO is going to be very, very important. Because I think if there's going to be an agenda that people are surprised by, it's going to be from China in this bilateral. And it's going to be, they're working on this now, that they will agree to bump up, as you know, the administration wants $750 billion versus $500 for the IMF commitment. And there's a draft in progress that they will agree to bump up their commitment by $100 billion, but only by buying bonds from the IMF. That, in turn, will bring up this issue of the SDR, which roiled markets pretty substantially, about a week ago or so. And it'll make it clear that China's in the business playing for a G2 that builds on that is U.S.-China, that builds out to a G5. I think that's going to be the thing I would watch for as the big news out of this out of the summit that people aren't expecting. The other is Sarkozy, and that's the entertainment guy, and his threat to walk out and of the summit if he doesn't get the financial stability forum exactly right. I think it's just because he doesn't trust Carla and wants to get back as soon as possible. But it's my own opinion.
So there was 1, 2, and 3. You said 3 points.
That was the third.
Okay.
Sarkozy.
Okay,
That's
great.
the entertainment point.
I see. Doug?
Well, I'm going to pick up on Richard's. Is this mic working? Can you guys hear me?
Hold it closer.
Okay, I'll do this one. Okay.
That's silly.
That's all right. Thanks. Let me pick up on Richard's point because I think where China comes out of this is going to be the major takeaway. And then I want to go back to Steve, your original question. China could go anywhere from 50 to 100 billion, and I've seen reports and heard that they're vacillating. And the form that takes is actually going to be a fascinating dynamic, because if it is bonds, then that means they're effectively not asking at this point for an increased quota, which means an increased seat at the table commensurate with their equity commitment, their capital commitment. And that's significant. But the form in which those bonds take and what currency or what quasi-currency it may be issued in is a very significant issue when it comes to the dollar, SDR. There's a grand sense that China's just posturing by talking about replacing the US dollar as a reserve currency. I know Richard and Bob and I have been on a number of working panels over the past year in which that's discussed, and it's usually the conclusion is not likely to happen. But I would continue to watch this space very carefully. I'm not as sanguine as others. I do think China's serious, that over time, and time can be 5 years, 10 years, or longer, that there's going to be a shift in the US dollar's role as a global currency reserve. And I think that we'll see some inklings of how they're thinking about that out of this. Now, back to your original question, Steve. I'm also less comfortable that the bar, as we've discussed it here, where it's set, that if we achieve that we actually achieve what needs to be achieved out of the G20 or out of global cooperation in its entirety. If you go back to September, October, November, there were great trial balloons sent out by everyone, from Sarkozy to Brown to the Chinese and the Japanese, talking about new global financial architecture. The Bretton Woods, did this just go off? I think I just lost this.
Push the button. Hold the bottom button.
Sorry. The bottom
Push
button.
it in.
Okay, got it. Okay. Sorry. Hello? Sorry. See if that works. There were great expectations set. The November meeting obviously failed to meet them, kicked it down the road to April, and now we're already tempering our expectations for what's going to come out of this. So I think in normal circumstances, what we just heard from the two other speakers as being a takeaway from a G20 summit would be absolutely huge. It would be actually dramatic. It would show global leaders coming together at a time of crisis. But actually, I think this crisis is qualitatively different, and I'm not sure that even those expectations, if they're met, are going to be enough. And I want to throw out one word, because we don't hear a lot about it in this country, but it is a word that is infused in the discussion of the G20 participants everywhere else, and that is values. And you hear this out of Sarkozy started it, but then it became sort of the mantra within Europe, and now I saw Gordon Brown used it earlier today. It is a values-based capitalist free market system. And in the US, we don't talk about that because it's kind of off limits. It sounds like we're heading towards socialism or communism. But in fact, the question of whether the free market capitalist system that underlies our global financial architecture is going to stay as it is going to be tweaked, or in fact whether there's going to be a rethink in which values play a part in that. And I would look to that and see if the word values creeps into the final communique, because if it does, I think it's a major, I don't want to call it a concession, let's say it's a major step by the US to embrace that broader sense that we need to change the financial architecture of the world.
Thank you very much. I think it's just dead. Thank you very much, Doug. We'll just try to muddle through here, sharing a mic. I want to also encourage those who are at the door, why don't you just come on down and join us here. Grab your sodas and chicken sandwiches and join us. Thank you very much. And we'll get this to the audience very soon. But let me just open up another front. Martin Wolf, George Soros, and others earlier this week in Washington at the New America Foundation sort of looked at their own prognostications about the G20, and they came up with some slightly different sorts of targets that they thought were important. One is that the collapse of consumption in the United States, the swing to savings here in the United States from 2.7% negative for households to 5% savings has created a real problem in terms of looking at the way the rest of the world grows. And so the challenge, they said, is very much at a summit like this, and it may not be doable, getting the surplus countries, which are three, Germany, Japan, and China, to do something far, far beyond what is expected, because this is a time when you've got to begin looking at how you're going to rewire that kind of growth, because the deficit nations, including the United States, aren't going to be in a position to do it. So while you generally mention stimulative measures, this seemed to be a larger call to the surplus countries, and Martin Wolf probably rang that bell loudest. The other thing that George Soros raised is that we've got in Eastern Europe, but you also have in many of the other developing nations of the world, a real collapse, and there's just going to be no resources there to stimulate those economies. So he and Kofi Annan called him right before his talk about this notion of special drawing rights, which I would appreciate. You mentioned SDRs a little bit, whether or not you think, and Soros said publicly that he believes that Barack Obama will surprise people and will at least initiate some discussion about an SDR strategy, which Soros explained to us allows these economies to use them to shore up their ostensible books, but it also allows them to spend them in other economies. So he says it stimulates us, it stimulates them. And I'm interested in how people look at, how you guys look at the SDRs. But the collapse of consumption problem and how you turn that around, Bob, and why you don't see this G20 meeting as a venue for that.
Thanks. Just very quickly, I think they're absolutely right. If there was a borrowing boom or bubble in the United States, there was an export boom, and one might even say an export bubble in some other countries. By bubble, I mean something that was not sustainable because it was based on American consumers borrowing a lot of money and spending a lot of money and incurring a lot of debt. So that if our borrowing was unsustainable, the exports of some of these countries to the United States to sell to the American consumer was also unsustainable. But that's not rarely brought into the equation, but it's nonetheless true, and Martin Wolf has been writing very eloquently about that. And therefore, I think it's quite right that these countries do need to concentrate more on bolstering internal demand if they want the United States to make its corrections and deleverage its economy, which it's going to have to do because that borrowing is unsustainable. So that part of the rebalancing equation is right. It's bigger than stimulus. It's sort of a fundamental rebalancing of the global system to rely less on debt.
Bob, can I just interrupt for a second? I mean, I think Bob's exactly right, and when he mentioned Martin's been writing this for a long time. The fact is, this is the conversation that was going on 10, 15 years ago, Larry Summers, this was one of his big things, and that was, but it was in the context of how do we get the U.S. Current account deficit down, back when that was what everyone was harping on about. And the same answer was proposed then in exactly the same tone and exactly the same way, which is you need to get Germany, Japan, and China to spend more. And I think the same blockade of, well, how do you do that? I mean, you go, just build more Costco's, or do you put little electronic helmets on their head and make them American? It's hard. It's hard to figure out. It's easy to say that. It's very hard to figure out how you get them to commit to a campaign of spending.
China's beginning to do this now.
But Chinese are going to be the first to come out of this because they are more American than these other two.
Resources.
And the other two are much more continental in a sense. Right. And China is much more of a spending culture.
Well, I think the toughest one for me to see, and it's interesting, 10 years ago I was at a economic forum. I don't know if Bob was there, but 10 years ago in Hakone, Japan, there were a lot of financial elites that were there, and I remember Summers and others saying the world is dangerously over-dependent upon an American consumer who at that time was over-consuming and underproducing.
And that was nothing compared to what happened the last 3 years.
Right, and that was 10 years ago. And so when you do it, and in Japan's situation, we know that while it continues to be a surplus nation, it's lost control of its toolkit. China can use the Sichuan earthquake, use a lot of other issues to sort of broaden the social safety net. The one that Martin Wolf raised, which would be interesting to open up to some of you who follow this, is Germany. And that Germany runs a $300 billion surplus. And I was at dinner last night in Washington with the majority leader of the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, from the German Bundestag, who was fiery in his anger to some degree, his theatrical anger at Barack Obama for pushing hard on the Germans to do more than they had done. And I kept telling him, I said, what evidence have you seen that Barack Obama has done this? Because all I've seen Barack Obama saying is that there'll be lots of different pathways forward, that different nations will have different things, and Germany will do what it needs to be, and really rash out. But it was interesting to see how he had positioned Obama as sort of a rival and an enemy of the process, and saying we will stand our ground and will not give, which is an incredible stridency on the eve of this summit, particularly given what's going on in Eastern Europe. Do you have any thoughts on that, Doug?
Well, yeah, I'd like to just pick up on not the specifics of Germany, but a broader issue that raises, which is the U.S. is, in most of the world's eyes, the cause of this global financial crisis. And there are those who will call it American-style capitalism, Anglo-American style capitalism.
Goldman Sachs capitalism.
I wouldn't go that far. But there is this great sense of relief in most of the quarters of the world that we've got Barack Obama attending this and not George W. Bush. And there's a great sense that Obama is an internationalist. He is a more intellectual guy. He's somebody they can work with. There's great relief. But he's still the president of the United States at a time in which a lot of countries have a lot of anger. And Secretary Paulson, before he left as Bush's Treasury Secretary, actually did apologize. I don't think he used the word apology, but he came pretty close to saying the U.S. was to blame for some, if not the majority, of this crisis. But that didn't really go far enough to undermine the general populist and political sense around the world that the U.S. caused this. And I think you're going to see, whether it's Germany or others, they're going to blame America for a variety of things. But the subtext is, you guys got us into this by preaching a form of capitalism that turned out to be unsustainable. And we resisted varying degrees, but we bought into it, and now we've blown up. And there's a lot of anger. So I think I'd like to see out of this summit a certain sense that the Obama administration is able to move beyond that. And then I think you're going to get into some of the real discussion points that will be productive and constructive for this globally cooperative world that we're talking about, that we all agree we need. But I think we've got to get beyond blame America for preaching this. And we mentioned Larry Summers. I mean, Summers, unfortunately, was the personification of some of the statements of the previous Democratic administration, where they were espousing a lot of the free market principles that now may have gone too far. So it'll be interesting to see how both Larry Summers himself and the people sitting across the table from him respond to him. because he's not known for his soft edges.
Right.
And there will be some back and forth I think we can expect to hear rumors of after the fact.
Richard, can you comment a little bit on DC's palace politics? You've got Larry Summers, Tim Geithner, who looks like Rahm Emanuel, and Larry keep pushing him out in the front to take the arrows. And you've got Paul Volcker. And we haven't heard a lot about Paul Volcker lately, but he seems to be incredibly popular among some folks, and wondering why the Obama administration didn't run with a Volcker to make some of the harsher, tougher decisions. Can you talk to all of these people? How do you see the intrigue right now, or the factions in White House economic policy making?
I think there's no question about that order. I mean, it's Summers runs the game, and that Tim works closely with him, and they thought that Volcker might actually be a challenge to that, and they pushed him neatly and deftly aside. And I think the only real danger is, I think Tim has really gotten his sea legs under him. I think he's been much better in public recently, and one of the things that people have to understand when they start criticizing this is we're actually working in our firm, and I'll be glad to share this, with anyone who wants to see it. We're working actually on a chart of what's been done so far, because in a sense there's so much that's been done. You've got policy fatigue, and people don't quite know the totality of what's already underway and what's already happened, what this administration has accomplished in its proverbial first 100 days has been almost incredible. I mean, there's certainly never been anything like it in American economic history, but it's so much. I mean, I literally wrote a thing for our internal traders saying, there's a $30 billion FHA program about to be announced for a certain segment of the mortgage market, and they're like, 30 billion. Who gives a shit? It really does. It really has gotten to the point where you've lost track of how much has been done, and I think it's important to put that in perspective. And you tossed a Treasury Secretary, who has a lot of experience, but who's been alone. I made an unfortunate joke on television that night. I said that luckily there's no one else at the Treasury, so Tim can use his skateboard wherever he wants to in the halls, which didn't go over that well. But that's what's happened. They've had to do a lot of this with a staff of 4 or 5 people. They've even brought back some of the Paulson people into Treasury temporarily, just to put some staff behind it.
For those interested, we'd love to be able to get that out. If you get that chart out, we'd be happy
and we're
email them.
working on it right now. We'll have it in the next couple of days, and I'll send it to you guys, and you guys can send it out.
Yes, Bob?
Richard made a very interesting point, and sort of the intensity of what's going on. Can you hear it back there? People
You're just nodding your head no.
People refer to the New Deal, but in the New Deal, at the height of the New Deal, the budget deficit was less than 6% of GDP. This fiscal year, the budget deficit is going to be something in the order of 13% of GDP, perhaps even more. In the New Deal, there was not a lot of governmental involvement in the economy in a direct sense. There were a lot of government programs, more than today, but the magnitude of the involvement in companies, banks, and AIG and other institutions is much greater. This is a very, very bold approach. We've never seen anything remotely comparable in history in the United States or abroad, where, and don't forget, in the New Deal, the other countries basically did very little, and now we're seeing this huge manifestation of governmental engagement all around the world, and I think that is a big difference. The problem is that we look at these things, Richard put his finger on it, we look at these things in terms of the parts, but when you add it all up, this is a remarkable display of government proactivity, the likes of which, maybe it's comparable to 1933 and 34, but there's no other period even remotely comparable to this.
And Bob, it's important to remember that none of this is hit yet.
No.
I mean, except for the interest rate cuts.
That's it.
All of this is still coming
takes time.
into the market.
That's right.
And people are like, oh my God, nothing's happening, we're still down. Yeah, that's true. We're going to see the impact of this over the
It takes
next
time to gain traction.
Yeah.
Let me follow up on one point so we don't lose track of it. On your point about SDRs, and that's going to be, there has been a U.S.
I saw your eyes roll.
Well, no, I'm in favor of it, but there's been a concern in the Treasury about this about a new issuance of SDRs. There are a lot of people who don't, I mean, it's paper money in effect. There are a lot of people who don't like it. I happen to be in favor of it, but the argument is, one, the governments lose a little bit of control over it, and two, someone has to stand behind this. You just can't print money, and there's some liabilities there if the SDRs aren't repaid to the IMF. So you got to figure out some formula. But basically, it's I think a very good idea. The problem with it is that you get SDRs in relation to your quota, and the countries that need the SDRs the most are countries that have relatively low quotas, the poorer countries. So the question would have to be not just a new issue of SDRs, which is in fact in the communique, the possibility of another issue of SDRs, but you have to find a way of reallocating them from the U.S. and the other large industrialized economies that have the bulk of the quotas to the countries that need them. Central and Eastern Europe desperately need more. Some of the poor countries of Africa need more. A lot of countries do. So that is an interesting political issue where you can get the Congress has to agree to this. This is not something the U.S. can just do because it's part of a global treaty that we're involved in. So I think it's a very good idea. The complexity of getting it through the Congress or any additional money through the Congress to the extent authorization is needed. An environment where all this money that Richard's talking about has already been spent. That's going to be a major effort. It's doable, but you have to do a big selling job to explain why it's in our interest as well as theirs.
This may be your task that you brought into the Obama administration.
I would like to do it because I will tell you, if Eastern Europe deteriorates badly, as it is, not all countries, not Poland, but most of the others are, or Czech Republic, Hungary, Latvia, Ukraine, and a number of others are really in deep, deep trouble. And a lot of the gains made after the Cold War are going to be sort of pushed way back. A lot of those benefits are just going to evaporate. So we've got to do this, and Western Europe has to take the lead, but we have to do something. I mean, we're still the major.
So watch for more news on SDRs this next week.
Yes.
Before I open to the floor, let me ask, because Bob, you're such an expert on Asia, and I in my youth was in Japan and spent time in Korea, China, and what you realize when which I know this is way too naive and too simple, but there is an argument that can be made that at the household level, folks didn't trust their government, didn't trust the ability of their future. They set aside money for their kids, their health. High saving societies are interesting because it's usually fear about something or lack of trust that generates at least the household side of that savings. Well, I know that's not the whole picture, but I don't think there's anyone who could look at the 1990s and argue that Americans didn't feel an overabundance of trust to some degree about. They had just-in-time money, just-in-time jobs, just-in-time opportunities. They could, jobs were being created and ripped up at ferocious speed, and we were coaxing Americans to trust this turbocharged economy, and it would still treat you well. And I'm wondering, given your experience in Asia, and have you looked at saving cultures, and what we've seen here, what do you think the consequences are if we never get back to that high trust economics, just-in-time dollars in America? And do you think that's a bad thing?
That's a very philosophical question. I do think that we trusted too much in sort of just-in-time money and easy credit and availability of credit. You can get whatever you want. You don't have to save. But interestingly enough, people say, well, the American way is to spend a lot and not save. That's actually not true. The United States used to be a fairly big saver, but the system became so easy to get credit, and credit became so readily available. I think we'll go back to a period, as we did after the Depression, where people will save more, not just out of fear, which is what they're doing now, but they'll think more carefully about it, in part because credit won't be as easily available, in part because the regulators will be very, very tough on exorbitant amounts of credit creation, and in part because individual psychologies as they did in the 1930s, will change. Now, the question is, can you get other countries to be less preoccupied with saving and more willing to spend? And there, I think it depends in part on what countries like China are doing. China's doing a very good thing, and that is they're strengthening healthcare, the healthcare system. So a lot of Chinese don't spend money because they're worried that if they get sick, they won't have enough money and the government won't help them. Used to have these barefoot doctors. It stopped that. Now they're doing much more in the area of healthcare, support for healthcare, health insurance, governmental health provision. The idea is not just that it's a good thing to deal with rural unrest, but it'll encourage people to spend money because they won't feel they have to save it for a rainy day when they get sick, because the government will provide for them. So that's the other part of that equation.
I just want to real quickly just say that this is 100% right, and I think China, as I said at the beginning, if there's a country that's going to be with the United States in marching us out of this, it is going to be China. They've expanded their budget deficit. Or they don't have a budget deficit. They've expanded their stimulus at least as fast a rate as we have. And you know, the anti-China people can say it's because they're worried about rural unrest and blah blah blah. They seem to have dealt with that in different ways. But they have spent a ton of money, and they're putting a ton of money to work on this. But we also can't forget India. India is also a consumer culture, very similar to ours and China. And they've done an enormous amount of stimulus. It doesn't get a lot of press because they don't issue a lot of bonds. It's not a real international country in that sense. But they've done an enormous amount of work, and they're going to be an important part of leading us out of this as well.
Just on the India-China thing, I mean, one of the big differences is reserves. I mean, India simply doesn't have an abundance of reserves, and China has some $2 trillion worth of reserves. So that's one of the big issues. But I do think we keep coming back to what's going to come out of the G20, and one of the major things is going to be what China's position is. You know, Bob Zoellick famously said in the past that we need to see China step up and be a reasonable stakeholder in the global financial system. And that's effectively what they're doing. I mean, for years they were kind of a free rider. They were saying, no, you know, U.S., you take the lead in all these difficult military and political instability issues. We're just going to be a small or a large, growing third world country. And now they, by choice or by necessity, are stepping up. That makes a lot of people nervous. But I think it's the right thing to do, and it goes to what Richard called the G2. A lot of people are calling the G2 as being the major driver of the future, you know, global financial system, and I think we're starting to see the framework of that.
Terrific. Let me open the floor to other comments and discussion, and don't be shy. Who would like to go first? Yes, and if you'll identify yourself. Yes.
At times it seems like a private conversation. The audible section doesn't reach this part of the room.
That is regrettable. We're trying to have a conversation, but certainly including all of you, and our sound system went out, so I apologize. But what would you like to share something about your own thinking about the London G20? Others? Rita Hauser.
Got to get a question started.
Yeah.
I'm not as optimistic about this G2 business that China is going to be the engine that helps pull us all out of all of this. I think their production this year is going to be way down. The latest estimates I saw was 6%, maybe less, whatever their numbers are, since they're not always credible. They've got a vast internal market to deal with, and unrest is a very, very large issue in the minds of the leaders, whatever we may think about it. There isn't a Chinese person in leadership capacity that you meet today and for years back who doesn't talk about social unrest. And when you get unemployment and 100 million men or so floating around China every night looking for work, you get very worried about that. So I don't see that. I mean, my analysis, I would put more stress with all the difficulties on Europe. The combined economy of Europe is as large as the United States, and probably even edging a little larger now. That seems to me a more reasonable engine to help the world at this time than China. So
Reactions?
Well, I think the benefit of dealing with China is, granted it's complex, but you're dealing with one country. When you're dealing with Europe, you're dealing with 27 individual countries, And the ability to get any kind of consensus, although I tend to be more optimistic about Europe than many of my peers who look at it and say, oh, it's never going to get its act together. I think Europe is, in fact, doing a pretty good job of smoothing out the differences between the countries and coming up with a modestly consensus-driven position for this upcoming summit. But I think that I go back to, again, my point about the reserves. I think the reason a lot of people are looking at China is China's got cash, and in a crisis situation, cash is king. And Europe, I mean, Germany does have a surplus economy, but effectively that balances out the other members of the EU, and so the EU as a whole is much less of a surplus area, and certainly less reserve-driven than is China. So I think that's why there's a certain emphasis on, or a hope, that China will get its act together and help drag people up, because in fact they have the cash and they have the potential for growth out of a middle class that doesn't really exist yet, certainly not as a spending driver.
Bob may want to jump in, but just my own response, Rita. I think China is in a complicated position, and I've been surprised, frankly, that some of its central bank authorities and others have made the comments that they have publicly. Because anyone who spends time in China realizes that China is still, in my view, both in a power position and economic position, kind of focused in on what its mercantile interests are. How can it move those forward? But it doesn't want the optics of global order to change. I think it wants real power, not cosmetic, but not the cosmetic responsibility. It would like the United States to remain very much seen by the rest of the world at the helm, but China would like to be behind the scenes, essentially making sure its interests are secured. And I think it's an interesting tight walk. And Bob, how do you see this with China's position?
I think you can make a couple of arguments on China. One, they do have a lot of money, and Doug's absolutely right. That is really one of the things that distinguishes them from almost anyone, really from anyone else, with the possible exception of Japan, which also has very substantial reserves. The other thing is China does not have a big budget deficit. In fact, they've had surpluses or small deficits. Japan's different. It has an enormous budget deficit. So China is in a great position to stimulate its own economy. I do think the problem is that we may expect too much of China as a country that can draw the rest of the world or help the rest of the world get out of this crisis. To the extent they're really not, they're a big economy, but as a portion of world GDP, they're still below 10% of world GDP. Mm-hmm. So, whereas, as Rita correctly points out, the EU and the US are roughly the same, something in the order of 25-26% of world GDP. So, growth in the US and the EU really has more of a global effect than China, but China, as Doug pointed out, is in a position to do more because it has more policy flexibility, and will certainly have a very big effect on Asia to the extent it can stimulate its economy. The other point that Doug made, I think, is very important to mention, and that is that China now it used to be a sleeping giant when it came to exerting global financial and economic influence, but no longer. And the fact that the Chinese government has questioned the role of the dollar, that Governor Zhou Xiaochuan has made this suggestion of using SDR as a sort of a global reserve currency or global currency, even if they're not initially accepted, China is now saying, look, we are a major power, we have views, we want our views to be heard, and the fact that they were pronounced right before the G20 summit was no accident, that they want to have a seat, not just a seat at the table physically, but just as the US and the UK were the two countries that developed the Bretton Woods system, the new system, whatever it is, even if it's not a full-blown Bretton Woods 2, the new system will depend, and Richard made this point quite well, on these two countries working together. And that is really, there are two big meetings that will take place in London. One is the G20, and the other is President Hu and President Obama, because whatever happens there, not just there, but as a follow-up, is going to be very important for the global system.
Behind Rita, this gentleman.
I was just wondering, given that the need for global rebalancing has been evident for so long, and there have been many warnings from the West to China. I'm sure that they've been aware of this themselves, the risk of consumption level in the West.
Right.
And when I think about that, and I think on the other hand that one would think the capacity of China to make the kinds of internal adjustments necessary would be very great, given that they're all essentially government programs, and it's not like they're afraid of social commercialize medicine in China.
Right.
Why has that proved to be so difficult? What are the prospects for success now? Maybe somebody could characterize the problem, why it's so hard.
On global rebalancing, well, I mean, if I may real quickly, I just think that I agree with Richard and Bob that China is actually moving very rapidly. It's a young, big economy, and it, as a young, big economy, has less inhibition to moving in different ways, but it does want to see its investments essentially elsewhere in the world pay off. And again, coming back to Rita's point, one of the things, whether we like it or not, if you go around the world sees China as an ascending, increasingly powerful, weightier nation. I keep calling it the Google of countries. And Europe and the United States, regrettably, whether it's true or not, look sort of like the Xerox of nations, meaning a large, well-branded, underperforming asset. And I find it unusual that both Xerox, the C.N. Mulcahy of Xerox, and Eric Schmidt of Google, who's the chairman of New America's board, are both on Barack Obama's economic advisory team. And to some degree, Obama's challenge, but I also think it's true for Europe, is how to rewire itself during a time of crisis to look like an ascending power, to take a well-branded, underperforming asset and make it perform better.
I was afraid you were going to call us the Yahoo of the...
You've got a great tie for Yahoo, though.
I do think, Rita's point about the unrest, I think actually reinforces the point that we've been trying to make here, which is it's one of the reasons the stimulus needs to be so aggressive. They cannot afford to take this lightly, and they don't. As you say, you can't talk to a Chinese leader who doesn't, in the first 20 minutes, bring that up as a major issue. And so that's part of the reason the stimulus package, I think, is so aggressive and so powerful. But there's another thing that I don't think got mentioned in the press. Just before this crisis hit, the Chinese central bank, People's Bank of China, allocated a significant, I can't remember the number right now, it was in the hundreds of billions of dollars to local and state-run banks to invest outside of China. I think that was the first time that government-run central authorities decided, outside of buying U.S. treasuries, they literally allocated the money into the treasuries of these local banks and said, go out and find projects around the world to invest in. This was not the old Japanese, let's find people we want to trade with. This was literally, let's go out and find how we can make more money. As the credit system unseizes, and this is one of the most important things, I think, because, Bob, Doug, 100% right. It's going to be a while before their consumption catches up with anything that, as a consumer culture, can do anything for the rest of the world. But as a holder of these reserves, you're going to start to see a flood of capital from China into the American and European credit systems that I think is going to be a big help as we start to get these wheels. And in fact, just one fun thing. One of the things that the Chinese are so worried about is that, it's so odd to get a lecture from the Chinese in this, but there was a phone call recently between the leaders, and they actually said we're worried about the U.S. As a country that's still in the grip of the rule of law. And there is a lot of concern about this at the national level in China. They're actually worried about whether they're protected by American law.
Baldas?
Just to shift it slightly away from China and the U.S., what is the panel's, and Bob, I'd be interested in your views in particular, thinking on out of the G20 in terms of a global regulatory framework? Back in the 30s, we came up with the bank, we came up with the fund, and what was then GATT and today's WTO. In terms of the global regulatory framework, do you think that the ground rules would be more focused on the transparency, or will it actually be more focused on prudential regulations, which can be a little stifling when you aren't able to make the distinction between traditional commercial banking and non-banking financial institutions?
Bob?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, certainly certainly there'll be more focus on transparency. That everyone seems to agree on, both domestically and internationally, particularly these esoteric new financial products that got away from people because people A, didn't understand them, and B, they had a lot of leverage, and no one knew how much leverage. There's this great quote by Bernanke when he spoke last year at the New York Economic Club, and he was asked, this is very buttoned down, Ben Bernanke, and he was asked, what is it that you'd like to know that you don't know to help you manage policy? He said, I'd like to know what the damn things are worth. That is these esoteric assets that are now being talked about, the bundled assets, the various kinds. And that was the case. That even if the head of the Federal Reserve didn't know, then most people didn't know either. And that was a problem. Even though they knew there was a risk, they just weren't able to quantify it. So transparency, I think, is critically important. But I think prudential supervision is definitely going to be part of the communique also. For instance, capital adequacy of financial institutions. Everyone seems to agree you need to raise capital standards in good times, so there's more of a buffer in bad times. You need to have what they call colleges of supervisors for globally influential institutions or institutions that can have systemic impact if they go under, large imbalances both for individual companies and systemic imbalances like big buildups of credit. All these things. It's not that there'll be one single regulator. I think that is not likely, although some European countries want that. It's basically unacceptable for the United States to have that. We can't even decide on one regulator internally, much less one that might sit in Brussels or somewhere else. But I do think there'll be a lot more interaction among regulators through this new financial supervisory board or stability board, and in the IMF and the BIS. So there'll be much more interaction and much more assertive supervision and prudential supervision also.
There was a quote, I'd love to say it was mine, but I saw it in today's Financial Times, saying that on the financial regulatory environment question, there are going to be three to be addressed. One is stability of the global financial system. Two is international cooperation. And three is maintaining the sovereignty and the independence of national regulators. You can't have all three. You can have two of the three, but you can't have all three. And I think it's going to be a very interesting dynamic. We're not going to see that resolved in this week's summit. But how those three get resolved is going to be a very interesting dynamic. I think, as an ex-investment banker, I am always saying, I think that on a global regulatory basis, what we need is coordinated enforcement. And I use the word enforcement, and nobody does. And I use it because fundamentally, financial professionals, at least in certain pockets of investment banking and financial services, are paid to make money by exploiting the arbitrage opportunities that exist in the world, and that includes regulatory arbitrage. So if you don't actually get down to the nub of the issue, which is enforcement, you're going to find that banks and financial professionals are going to try and exploit those slight arbitrage opportunities or big arbitrage opportunities. And I don't see that there's going to be any coordinated enforcement anytime soon. I think that, as Bob said, a super regulator is unlikely to come out of this. I think there will be greater coordination, but I don't see that we're going to actually get to that final stage of global coordinated enforcement anytime soon. And I think that's a potential risk to the system.
Let me move out of the technical and ask, beginning with Richard, a pure politics question. It seems to me that Gordon Brown in the UK is going to get a lot of credit for the London summit, whether it succeeds or fails. They'll all make it look like it succeeds. And he was bouncing around between China and Saudi Arabia and trying to get greater commitment to the IMF. You've got Sarkozy, and he's got his ornament that he's very committed to. What does Obama come to? Normally, what is the... Does he have to elbow them out and sort of show, here's the piece of the recovery plan for the world that is, Obama owns? Or does he actually act like the selfless global leader and is going to let all these guys have their day in the sun and walk away with a very, very low footprint?
I think it'll be the latter. I mean, the press is going to cover him, obviously, heavily, but from what I've heard from the White House people, his intention is to go there, make his first appearance, make it gracious, make it articulate, all of that kind of stuff, but to listen. And then he's going to go on, as you know, a few countries tour, but to leave his footprint there as someone who's ready to work with the other leaders. I mean, in a weird way, going back to the last president's father, the first George Bush, who called for a new world order. He's not going to be that grandiose about it, but he's going to leave people with the impression that's what he wants to help to achieve.
But does that reinforce the view that some of the world have that this is America really slipping out of its leadership role? I mean, does it begin to reinforce the doubt around the world about America's ability to achieve the objectives it sets out?
I think what you're going to see is the confidence with which he sends that message actually reinforces America's leadership role. The fact that we're slipping out of in toward some kind of hegemony, rather than a unilateral position is undoubtable. I don't think there's any sense fighting that. I think there's a way to embrace it and to use it. And I think this president, and certainly the way he's handling himself, is almost the perfect instrument. I remember at dinner with Gorbachev a couple of years ago, and I said, what was the best thing, who was the best leader you saw as president? He said President Bush, the first one. And I said, well, what did he do that was so great? And he said, he shut up. He said, if the U.S. had started gloating about the collapse, he would have never been able to carry that off.
Interesting. Bob, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Richard put it very well. I think America's leadership now is very different from the period right after World War II. The two are not even closely analogous, and yet people sort of say, well, this is a reprise of the period right after World War II when we created these new institutions. Gosh,
just dump that thing.
Yeah.
Let's
is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. This is very different from the period right after World War II. And people make the analogy between the two, that we use that period to create new institutions. The difference is that in those days it was essentially one country, the United States, with a little bit of support from the UK that did this. Now you've got 20 countries, and American power, while still great, is, as Richard points out, not nearly we don't have the preeminence that we had in those days. We're still important, and we're a great convener, we're a great provider of ideas, we're a great puller together of countries, but we can't decide on these things ourselves and have others necessarily come along with us. At least for the most part, they will not. So there's been a sort of devolution of power around the world, the Chinas, the Indias, but not just those. I mean, Russia has influence in its area. There are a great many others. Brazil, certainly Lula's already said he wants to shake things up or spice them up to deal with the blue-eyed people who made this crisis happen. So I think that it has to, the leadership is has to be exercised in a very different way. And I do think the first trip of a new American president, one of the things they'll want from him is for him to understand their points of view, and as Richard says, what is on their mind. The second, they want to see leadership in his own country, and I think that President Obama can without overdoing it, say that we've taken a lot of measures at home, not that others haven't, but we've really been very bold at home. That strengthens his leadership. And three, the follow-up. The follow-up is going to be very important. Having officials, American officials, work with officials of other countries to make sure that these things are implemented. This is really not the end of the process. This really is the beginning of an ongoing dialogue just to improve the functioning of the global system. And I think if the United States plays a very strong role, but not a dictatorial, not a lecturing role, which it did in the past, we'll probably be better off.
And I think that's one of the reasons that Obama's going to announce a reconvening, I think in early May or mid-May of the group, and so it keeps the ball rolling.
Just in terms of the expectations that were set for this were not U.S.-led. So in a sense, if you agree with Richard, which I do, then Obama's not going to be the one who goes out and tries to be the dictator or to take the spotlight per se. the expectations that will or will not be met will not be expectations that the U.S. actually set. Sarkozy was way out in front, Merkel was way out in front, Brown, of course, was way out in front in setting the expectations very high. If they're met or not, it's almost not a function of the U.S. It's Obama personally on the world stage. That's almost separate and apart from the communique that comes out of the G20.
Thank you. Yes, right here. And if you'll share with us
institutions or philosophies that help to pave the road to the abyss that we are currently in.
If we can have really brief answers, because there's a lot of questions, but
so basically,
I think Bob should go first.
Who caused this?
Doug, he started.
Well, so I was mentioned by name.
Throw away that mic.
Here.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Too bad. Okay. Basically, the question, I suppose, is what got us into this mess?
I know what got us into it, but specifically, there are people who are in charge of moving other people in particular directions, and in your mind, the fall off the cliff began with what and who?
Wait, just a brief elaboration of your "our kind of capitalism" comment.
Yeah, I think the world's financial system is right now imbalanced. And the structural causes of those imbalances, if you're in Asia, you claim that the U.S. and the West is too profligate in their spending. If you're in the West, you claim that the Chinese and other countries were simply, exploiting their surplus status and not spending enough. That leads to these imbalances, et cetera. In terms of who you could blame for that, you could go back 50 years and sort of just the foundations of the global economy have grown up that way. So I'm not sure it's the liquidity-driven nations or it's the spending nations. I think we have some very deep structural issues. Certainly Martin Wolf has been writing a lot about this. I wouldn't want to point a finger and say it's one or the other. I think it is just a systemic issue we're all going to have to grapple with.
Let me get some other folks to jump in here, but what I will say is that we had a foreshock of what's happening today in 1997 and 98 in East Asia, the East Asian economic shocks, where you had a quick withdrawal of capital, you had information problems, you had the LTCM case in which Alan Greenspan and Bill McDonough and others at the New York Fed intervened to unwind a major hedge fund in the world. And that was, to some degree, a microcosm of a much larger shock that hit the world. And so that foreshock was something that didn't focus the mind and the attentions on the question you had. And then we had 10 more years of that. But let me gather some more voices here. John Watts?
I was about to say, I think that this blaming the U.S. and in particular a particular part of our capital market is dropping off very sharply as people realize that no matter how connected they were to, let's say, subprime mortgages or to bundle securities,
right?
Whatever economy we're having the first really harmonious global contraction.
Right.
And since last June to this June, we'll probably see the biggest drop in production, employment, international finance, availability of commercial bank credit that the world's ever known.
Isn't it kind of like a small earthquake fault triggering the San Andreas?
People in central banks and in business are beginning to understand that, and it's very sobering. And then my question, though, is that I think U.S. president has been most articulate about the size of this problem. He hasn't been shy to describe it in colorful terms and the need. And if pressed, I think he and his lieutenants would say, we're not risking doing too much. Mm. And that's the opposite view you get from much of Europe.
Right.
And for structural reasons, like they have 2/3 of their financial system is in banks and only less than a third of ours is. But that's just an explanatory variable. It seemed to me this group of 20 is going to run up against that somehow. They're increasingly understanding that Obama's right and the Americans, the size of their response is correct. And yet you've got people like Trichet and the Germans saying, I'm not sure what they're saying, but they're saying the big risk is to do too much.
That's exactly right from what I heard from the Germans.
What I don't understand is where they get that and what's going to happen, if anything, in this meeting to bring us closer to seeing the problem in the same light.
Right. Let me get another question. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I was just
Can you share with us who you are?
My name's Lee, will be co-founder
thinking about doing too much, and what Richard has said about, perhaps the impact of what we've done thus far, what will the impact be, and could inflation rise so much that it could be counterintuitive?
So inflation question. Any final questions, comments? Yes, sir, in the very back. Or two of you, and and then we'll finish up with the panel.
So I think you could summarize what governments worldwide have done in response to this financial crisis, if you wanted to be reductionist about it, by saying that they've spent money and they've transferred private debt onto public balance sheets, and they've done this all to a lesser or greater extent. Directionally, that's what they've all done. In light of that, I'm wondering if you guys could comment on kind of the rise in sovereign risk in this environment, and in particular, the threat to fiat currencies.
Thank you. And right in front of you. And if you'll share with us who you are.
David Larkin. So I'm wondering, how do you price the damn things? I mean, it seems like that's been the root of the thing, and a lot of attention in the press lately has been about the banks. That's really what you read about it. Are we finally going to fix the banks? Are we going to fix the banks? It seems until J.P. Morgan, Citibank, and so on are actually stabilized that the pillars of this thing are going to be pretty shaky. So is Geithner's plan viable? Is the rest of the world going to see it that way? Or is it sort of going to be, hey, he's waiting until the economy grows and we sort of grow our way out of the problem, as opposed to actually fixing the problem?
Thank you. Let me start with Richard to take a whack at any of these you'd like.
Well, I think the first question's very important. Just one sentence answers for each of these, but the big difference now is the Europeans have a social safety net and a savings culture that we don't have. They feel like they have enough coverage. In other words, what we've done is to construct a social safety net in a sense, as you said, by nationalizing public assets. We've in a sense constructed a social safety net ad hoc in the best American fashion. Just quickly on inflation, I think we're absolutely going to have to deal with this, but this is a problem that almost every policymaker I know would love to have to deal with at this point. On the fiat currencies, I do think that that's a two-stage down the road issue, because when everyone says, well, what about the risk to the dollar? What about the risk to the dollar? The fact is, you've got to do something with your money, and you've got to figure out where you're going to put it, unless it's under mattresses. And we haven't gotten to the under mattresses stage of this yet, and hopefully we never will. The risk to fiat currencies would be real, because we don't, as Bob started out at the beginning talking about SDRs, we don't have gold underlying this. We don't have anything underlying this anymore. We don't seem to be anywhere near that yet, but if this stuff doesn't work that we're doing now, which I have every reason to believe it will, then we start to enter into the kind of territory you're talking about, which I would then suggest everyone to buy land in South Dakota.
Doug?
I'll just pick on the inflation and currency issue and go back to China, which is, the point that Wen Jiabao made about his concern over the U.S. dollar was really related to this whole discussion, because he was basically saying if you're going to spend X trillions of dollars, that's going to ultimately have an inflationary impact, and that's going to undermine the value of our holdings in China. And I think that that's a very real consideration for China, because they are the single largest holder of U.S. securities in the world. And I wouldn't dismiss that as being a concern for them that is very real and that actually manifests itself in some real actions. Noteworthy today, China and Argentina entered into a $105 billion swap agreement, with the Chinese currency going to suddenly become the currency by which China and Argentina do their bilateral trade. That's actually very significant. $105 billion is not a huge amount of money in global commerce, but when you start seeing China and South American countries doing trade and entering into agreements in Chinese currency, watch this space.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. One, on the inflation, I totally agree with Richard. I don't lose a lot of sleep over inflation. In fact, root for it. Because the only way we'll have inflation is if we get close to full capacity utilization, and we're very far from that now. And the inflation doesn't come from printing a lot of money or big budget deficits. It comes when the economy reduces or eliminates excess capacity, and that means it's growing rapidly. And we're not growing rapidly. We've got a lot of excess capacity. And when you get to inflation, we know what to do about it. It's much easier to curtail inflation, as we've seen. Central banks are good at this. It's a lot harder to deal with deflation or an economy which is getting close to deflation. We're not there yet, but we could well see that. Even if this package works, which I think it will, I think the cumulative effect of all these things is going to be positive. We could still have a weak economy. We could still move into an environment where we have negative price increases over a period of time. That's very hard to cope with because monetary policy then becomes very difficult to make effective. The second point on sovereign risk or fiat currency issues, the Treasury has a lot of capacity to borrow still without undermining the sovereign risk of undermining the sovereign creditworthiness of the United States. This has been way exaggerated. We have about 40% of debt's about 40% of GDP. Debt held by the public, lots held by the Social Security system. Public debt, from the point of view of this argument, is what you need to focus on, and that will get up to 65 or maybe 70 in the next couple of years. World War II, we were on 110%. In addition, the cost of the borrowing by the federal government is very small because the reason the federal government has to borrow, as has been pointed out, is that borrow and spend is that other people are not spending and companies are not spending, and they're not borrowing so much either because they have to deleverage. So there are plenty of monies available domestically to finance the United States. And then you look at other currencies. Are they any better? Europe's in a worse position, I think, from a growth point of view, and it has the problems of Eastern Europe to cope with also. So I don't see this as being, for the moment, a big problem. If we, after the emergency's over, we don't get back on the course of sound fiscal policy, then we have a big problem, but that's probably in several years from now. And the European issue, just to touch briefly on that, the Europeans have these so-called built-in stabilizers that are very generous, very substantial amounts, and will go into the spending stream as a result of those. And they argue that because these kick in automatically, they don't really need to do as much proactive stimulus as we do. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. It's very controversial. And in fact, the Europeans may go back later and decide they have to do more proactive stimulus, which means more spending, but they don't want to do it. It's not part of their culture, and for the moment, the Germans and the French are both opposed to it. If it starts working here and in China, maybe there'll be more pressure in Europe because there's social unrest in Europe. We have not seen that here. We don't see company executives being held in factories. We don't see any of that here. You do see it in Europe, and the Europeans may conclude that, well, they're not intuitively in favor of more direct stimulus. They're going to have to do something more, and maybe almost certainly more quantitative easing by the European Central Bank.
Before I close, I should say on behalf of the New America Foundation, which last Thursday, our economic growth program had a very, very large forum in D.C., the videos of which are all available online. We had such speakers as Desmond Lockman from the American Enterprise Institute, who's very worried about the survival of the euro, for instance, in its current form. A very compelling conversation he had. George Soros, Martin Wolf, Laura Tyson, and others, in addition to these great discussions today. And as part of what we've done, we've created a resource page for those interested in the issues related to the London G20 summit, and all of those PowerPoints and whatnot are online for those of you who are addicts for this type of discussion. But what we try and do, I think what Rachel White, our Vice President, New America Foundation, Richard Manley, a member of our board, Doug, my colleague, Robert, whenever we can get him, we're all policy wonks attempting to try to focus on the question of what would good public policy look like, and we do this in the foreign policy area, we do it in health and education and a wide variety of issues. So I want to thank my colleague Rachel for inviting me up for my first salon at the Core Club. I want to thank all of you, particularly those who are Leadership Council members, board members, and supporters of what we're trying to do, and we'll keep bringing these forums up to New York, and we'll work on the sound system. But please join me in thanking Robert Hormats, Doug Redeker, and Richard Medley. Thank you all very much for coming.